Hello everyone, today I'll be reviewing McCabe and Mrs. Miller. So McCabe and Mrs. Miller came out in 1971 and was directed by Robert Altman, and this film stars Warren Beatty and Julie Christie. So this film is a western and it is set in the northwest of America in Washington, and it's in an area where it's very snowy and very cold. And Warren Beatty, he comes into this town. He plays a character called McCabe, and he is a gambler. And at the start of this film we see him buy some prostitutes, but not for entertainment, as an investment, as he wants to set up a whorehouse with a saloon and a bathhouse out the back. So he's essentially a businessman and is looking to make some money. Then we have Julie Christie's character, Mrs. Miller. She comes into town and she wants to become McCabe's business partner, and we get this interesting scene between McCabe and Mrs. Miller where they're discussing the business, and it appears that Mrs. Miller, she certainly knows a lot about business, and she's saying to McCabe, you know, you don't exactly know what you're doing, you obviously don't know much about women, and I have some ideas which will be really useful. So the two of them, they essentially set up this business together and end up making some money. What we later see happen, although it's not explicitly shown, is that it appears as though the two of them start to have a relationship together. Now, the way that Robert Altman directs the film, he doesn't really make it very clear. It's almost sometimes up to the audience to decide exactly what's happening. But it later appears that actually the two of them are sleeping together, but it appears that McCabe is actually paying Mrs. Miller for this, and that, you know, he seems to be falling in love with her, but she doesn't necessarily feel the same way. At least that's what I gained from this film. Later on, we have these rich men. They come into town and they have lots of money and they want to buy the business, but McCabe and Mrs. Miller, they don't necessarily want to do this, and McCabe is really reluctant to give up the business. Later on, it appears as though some men might be coming into town in order to kill McCabe. Now, if you've ever seen any of Robert Altman's films before, you will know exactly what to expect, because Robert Altman, he has a certain way of directing and he has certain techniques used within his films, as I've seen two of his other films, MASH and Nashville, and this certainly has quite a similar feel to it. So what I did like about this film is that you can't fault the performances in this film. The acting is superb. I think Julie Christie is particularly good. She has a Cockney accent in this film and she's very convincing, and she plays a really different character to the one she played in Dr. Zhivago, which I watched a few weeks earlier. Also, Warren Beatty is great. He has some great lines, some brilliant lines of dialogue, and he has some really great scenes where he's actually just talking to himself, where he's expressing his thoughts, and it generally works very well. And we also get lots of other characters that are in this town which are always talking, and with Robert Altman's technique of using the overlapping dialogue, it certainly makes this film seem very realistic and very authentic, and I really did get a sense that this is probably a lot more what the West was really like when you compare it to lots of other Hollywood westerns. And I must say, I really do like the setting of this film. Obviously, as I said, it's set in the northwest of America, where it's really cold and there's lots of snow, and it's obviously really different to what we expect of a western in the hot, dusty deserts of Arizona and Texas. So that was quite nice to see. We also get a soundtrack which is by Leonard Cohen, and we get some ballads throughout this film with Leonard Cohen singing, and I generally think it works really well. I'm not particularly familiar with Leonard Cohen, but I think his songs really worked well in this film, and they really go with the tone of it. Normally I wouldn't have thought that this type of music would suit a western, but in this one it certainly works very well. I also have to say we get some great scenes in this film. I think my favourite scene in the film is these scenes where there were these two guys on the bridge and they have this duel, and it's just a really tense scene, and yes, it's really suspenseful stuff. I am also a really big fan of the way the film ends. I suppose in a way it's similar to the duel that's on the bridge earlier on, but I don't really want to spoil it too much, as I might spoil the ending for you, but that final 20 minutes of the film I think is some of the best stuff in the whole film. Now, unfortunately, I do have a few problems with this film. I do have some stuff that I didn't particularly like about it, which I will say. So as I mentioned earlier, Robert Altman, his directing style is quite interesting. So in a lot of his films, he uses the technique of the overlapping dialogue where the characters are talking over each other. And I think during the first 5 to 10 minutes of this film, it's set in this saloon or this bar, and you have these characters that group around this table, they're playing a card game, and because of that overlapping dialogue, I couldn't understand what the characters were saying. Now, I realised after a while, yes, this is a Robert Altman film, so I think a lot of the time Robert Altman wasn't expecting us to have to understand everything because the dialogue isn't always important, but I think because of that, I sort of took a bit of a step back and I stopped trying to understand what the characters were saying, because I realised that, yeah, that's not entirely the point. We're not always supposed to understand because of this overlapping dialogue, and it certainly is more realistic. You know, this is the way people talk in real life. I've had lots of people interrupt me when I'm talking, so yes, I can say that's definitely true. However, because I took that step back, I think I probably missed out some of the dialogue in some more key moments when it was just a one-on-one conversation. And I read some other reviews of this film, and I was reading it thinking, yeah, I completely missed that scene, or I completely missed that bit of dialogue because I was so used to the overlapping dialogue in other scenes that I probably wasn't paying attention. So that's probably more my fault that I wasn't understanding it. Now, what was interesting about the way this film was shot is that it uses this technique known as flashing, which is where the film is pre-exposed. The film negative was pre-exposed before shooting, and it just gives this film this whole murky, fuzzy, blurry look. And I believe the reason for this was that Robert Altman wanted the film to look more distinctive so that people wouldn't mess with it, and that it would just give a real different look to the film. And it just gives the film this real dreary, murky look. I have to be honest, I do not like this. I don't think it worked, and it just means that the film looks very blurry, and sometimes, particularly in a lot of the shots where it's set inside, where it's only lit by candlelight, it is quite difficult to see what's going on. And in my opinion, it just makes the film look quite cheap, as if it was filmed using inexpensive equipment. Now, I understand it was something a bit different, and you know, like a lot of Robert Altman's films, obviously he hired a cinematographer to do this, and yeah, they wanted to do something different, and some people really like it, but I didn't particularly like it. And in fact, this technique wasn't used in the final 20 minutes of the film, which is actually probably one of my favourite bits of the film. And I just think it's a bit of a shame, because a lot of the shots in this film, they do look really beautiful, and they would have looked even better if it wasn't for that murky, hazy look that this technique was used on the film. So if this flashing technique, pre-exposing the film, wasn't used, I just think the film would have looked better. As I said, I might be one of the only people that thought that. I was looking at other reviews. A lot of people disagree with me on that. That's just my personal opinion. And unfortunately, I do have to say that in general, the plot of the film, it's not the most interesting in my opinion. It's a bit slow paced, and I wasn't entirely interested all the way through. So overall, I'm afraid I do have mixed opinions about this film. I think it is a good Western. I just don't think it's one of my favourite Westerns. It is one I will definitely revisit at some point, although not too soon. So the acting is great. In terms of the setting, I really like. Unfortunately, I'm not a big fan of the overlapping dialogue, and yeah, the flashing technique of pre-exposing the film before shooting, that wasn't something I particularly enjoyed. So I'm going to have to say, I'm going to give it a rating of 7 out of 10, because overall I do think it is a good Western. I just think it could have been better. However, being a Robert Altman film, it was sort of what I expected. So there we go. So that is my review of McCabe and Mrs. Miller. So what do you guys think? Have you seen McCabe and Mrs. Miller? Do you like it? Do you dislike it? Please let me know what your thoughts are down in the comment section below. Anyway, thank you all very much for watching. I'll see you all in the next video. Take care.